On May 17, 1887, the noon heat in Sage Hollow, Colorado Territory, stood at 102 degrees in the shade behind the church, and by sundown the creek that had carried the settlement through 12 hard years ran so thin that wagon ruts beside its bank held more standing water than its own channel. The town counted 346 souls that spring, most bound to one another by debt, grain, and wagon trade, and almost all bound to that creek by habit, so old it had become a form of belief. Men with hats pulled low crouched at the banks and watched minnows flash in pockets no deeper than a hand. Women stood in line at the two public wells with pails and crock jars, measuring silence between one creak of rope and the next. Cattle at the south pens shoved each other against dry trough boards until the nails loosened. Dust climbed every fence post and stayed there. Nothing moved quickly except worry. By the time the sun dropped behind the buttes, talk of the heat had settled into the same hard rhythm as the creak of well ropes and the cough of dry stock. In Sage Hollow, men measured a season by what vanished first: green along ditch banks, then water in the creek bends, then patience. Clint heard enough of that talk at the livery and the pump line to know June would not be merciful. Clint Tucker worked a basalt lot 1 mile north of town, a dark, stony rise locals called useless ground, where only sage and stubborn grass had kept a claim on life. He was 38 years old, broad through the shoulders with a right hand half closed from an old crush at a railroad pump station west of Pueblo, where a slipped flywheel had pinned him against iron and ended his contract in a single morning. The bones had set badly, the fingers had lost full opening, and the railroad had paid him $40 and dismissal. Yet the injury had not taken what mattered most in his trade. He still read pressure by sound. He still judged leakage by soil smell. He still knew how long a leather seal could hold before heat turned it brittle. Before rail work, before Colorado, before that hand had changed shape, he had grown up in Tennessee Hill Country where his mother, Ruth Tucker, had kept 6 children alive through 3 dry spells by teaching them to look for water where impatient men never looked. She had shown him that willow roots reached farther than cottonwood when surface flow failed. That morning, cool stone beneath warm dust often marked slow subsurface movement, that seep lines on a north slope could feed a family if shaded and drawn with discipline. She had died in August of 1871, fever after a summer flood, and her son had buried her above a spring box she had lined herself with river rock and clay. The knowledge had not come to him as folklore. It came as method, repeated until it became judgment. Her father had learned similar practices in Tennessee from older mountain settlers who built banked spring houses long before steel pumps reached them, and Clint carried that chain forward without ornament. He had spent the 8 years after the railroad injury repairing failed wells and pump heads along scattered camps from Cannon City to Leadville, where he saw the same pattern repeated under different skies. Settlements trusted visible water until visible water vanished, then paid dearly for rushed digging. A shaft sunk in panic, without reading rock fracture or recharge, often yielded nothing but debt and cracked hope. By the second week of May 1887, he had walked every drainage line within 4 miles of Sage Hollow at dawn and dusk, measuring ground temperature with the back of his wrist, cutting test holes with a narrow auger, and marking spots where damp held after wind had stripped the topsoil. One place stayed cool each morning. One place answered. Silas Kincaid, owner of the general store and keeper of most town credit ledgers, watched that work from his porch with the confidence of a man whose shelves still held imported flour, lamp oil, and coffee tins stacked to the rafters. He wore broadcloth even in heat, a vest stretched over a prosperous middle, and polished boots that took dust but did not seem to belong to it. In public account books he was careful and precise, and Clint had seen enough of his terms to know patience came dear. When he saw Clint setting stakes in basalt and hauling broken stone in a one-wheeled cart, he gave the project its name in front of 6 teamsters and the post rider. "Tucker is building himself a puddle," Silas said, voice carrying across the porch rail. "A fine, cool cellar for one spoonful of muddy pride." By evening, boys at the hitch posts were repeating it. By Sunday, the phrase had reached church steps and wash lines. Tucker's Puddle. The name spread from corral gates to supper tables, and laughter followed it. Clint heard it and continued setting grade pegs. On June 2nd, the second well at the schoolhouse, which had held 11 feet of standing water in April, dropped to less than 2 feet. The rope came up wet only on its last turns. At the same council meeting, a territorial freight captain reported washouts on eastern lines and warned that the next rail shipment of flour and barrel stock might be delayed 6 weeks. Sage Hollow had $420 in uncommitted town funds. Under Silas Kincaid's urging, the council voted to spend it on shallow catchments scraped near his grain warehouse, where runoff could be collected if summer storms returned. After that vote, Clint crossed the plank floor of the general store and set a written list on the counter. 2 kegs of 8-penny nails, 100 pounds of hydrated lime, 30 feet of 2-inch pipe, and 1 hand-pump cylinder with threaded collar. Silas read the list once and slid it back. "A puddle does not warrant an account," he said. "Cash or nothing." Clint nodded, folded the paper, and left without argument. The next morning, he sold his iron-bound tool chest for $54, 2 mules for $88, and a silver watch with a cracked enamel face for $26, receiving $168 in hard cash. He returned to the same counter and paid full price. Silas took the money and made no change in expression. The excavation began that afternoon on the north slope where dawn shade lasted longest. Clint set his tunnel mouth 3 feet above a natural draw to protect against storm silt, then cut inward at a measured fall of 1 inch per 4 feet, so seep water would move toward collection instead of pooling against supports. He drove the first section through mixed basalt rubble and clay, then reached fractured limestone at 10 feet, where the pick rang differently and came away cool even in late heat. He worked with a short-handled mattock adapted for his injured grip, bracing the tool against his forearm and shoulder rather than relying on finger spread. He shored the first 12 feet with juniper timbers cut to 6 by 6 inches, set at 18-inch intervals, each post footed on flat stone to resist settling. The timbers cost him $19.40 from a sawyer south of Elkhorn Crossing. He sealed joints with clay pug and hammered the nail heads flush to reduce snagging in low light. At 26 feet, where the fracture opened into a damp seam, he marked the chamber for a cistern 12 feet wide, 16 feet long, and 9 feet deep. The stone came out in loads, 1 cart at a time, and went into retaining walls around the shed he intended to build above the shaft. 3 days passed after the council vote before the first boys came to watch openly, and soon there were adults as well, leaning in shade, offering comments in tones meant to travel. "He is digging his own grave cooler than his house. A man can drown in pride before he sees water. Best puddle in 3 counties if laughter could fill it." Clint answered none of it. At dusk, when the last onlookers had gone, he sat on an overturned bucket beside the tunnel mouth and ran his good hand along the damp limestone he had uncovered. The basalt lot radiated heat like a forge plate, but from the cut itself a thin breath of cool rose, steady as a promise. He spoke once into the failing light, not to the town and not to the men who mocked him. "Let them talk," he said. "Words do not fill a barrel." By the middle of June, he had laid the cistern floor in 3 layers, fist-size rock for drainage, a 4-inch bed of river sand hauled from the creek's remaining bends, and a lime clay mortar cap troweled tight against seep loss. He built a charcoal filtration crib from burned cottonwood, packed it between slatted boards, and planned the hand pump placement so draw would remain slow enough to preserve recharge. Every measurement had a reason. Every reason came from years of watching haste fail. Sage Hollow still called it Tucker's Puddle. Clint Tucker kept digging anyway. The next morning, June 18th, dawn arrived without dew, and at 6 o'clock the thermometer nailed to the schoolhouse porch already read 89 degrees. Heat moved across Sage Hollow before breakfast like a silent claim being staked, pressing through clapboard walls, lifting pitch from roof seams, and turning the iron pump handles too hot for a child to grip barehanded. At well number 1, the rope bucket struck bottom mud on its second drop. At well number 2, 3 women waited 40 minutes for a half barrel. The creek at the Cottonwood Bend showed stone where water should have run, and men who had crossed that bend for years walked farther downstream each hour, searching for pockets deep enough to fill 1 can at a time. Nothing in the town had failed all at once. Everything was failing by inches. Clint spent that day below ground from first light until nearly dark, widening the chamber shoulders and cutting a narrow feeder trench along the coolest fracture line, then climbing out every 2 hours to cool the pump iron with damp cloth and record seep-rise on a pine tally board. He marked each interval in carpenter pencil. 8 gallons in 90 minutes at first draw, then 6, then 9, after a 4-hour rest. It wasn't abundance, but it was pattern, and pattern meant planning. He had learned that distinction long before Colorado, when he was 16, and Ruth Tucker sent him uphill with 2 buckets and told him he would draw no more than 1 bucket from any spring box before moving to the next, because greed emptied a source faster than drought did. She had never called that method wisdom. She had called it arithmetic. By 21st June, the town council ordered the shallow catchments finished beside Silas Kincaid's grain warehouse. 12 laborers cut basins 3 feet deep and lined them with hard-packed clay, then set plank covers to slow evaporation. The work cost $402.70, leaving $17.30 in public funds. For 3 days, a thin thunderhead built over the west ridge and broke apart before reaching town, and by the 4th day the catchments held only wind-blown dust, 2 dead grasshoppers, and a skin of mineral crust at the lowest edges. Silas stood at the warehouse platform and said the rain would come next week. He said it in the tone of a man accustomed to being believed. Clint bought what he still lacked in strict sequence. On June 23rd, he paid $11 for 2 wagon loads of rounded stone from an abandoned creek cut north of Elkhorn Crossing. On June 24th, he paid $6.40 for beeswax and lampblack to treat seamcloth. On June 25th, he paid $3.20 for 3 hides from a butcher in Coldwater Camp and cut them into strips for pump leathers, soaking them overnight in rendered tallow and boiled linseed oil so they would swell tight under draw. The old boiler smith in him showed in every choice. Metal gave strength, but seals gave life. A pump failed from the edge inward. Children began coming in pairs after lessons, perching on the basalt wall and counting his timber sets aloud as if they were tally marks in a game. Adults followed, usually in the cooler hour before sundown, and mockery grew more specific as the project took shape. A carpenter declared the tunnel would cave by August because no sane builder trusted juniper in that heat. A ranch foreman swore that limestone seep turned bitter by midsummer and would sour a family's stomach in 1 day. Silas repeated his porch judgment for new listeners and added terms suited to his audience. "Tucker has made himself a bank vault with no money in it," he said one evening to 3 freighters and the post-rider. "The man stores stone and calls it foresight." Clint answered only when he had to answer fact. When one woman asked whether he would sell by bucket if water came, he said, "If it holds, It will be rationed by need and measured by ledger, not by shouting. When a teamster laughed and asked whether pride had become a trade good, Clint lifted a broken pump valve from his tool crate and set it in the teamster's palm. "This failed because one man drew too hard and too fast," he said. "A spring can fail by the same hand." Then he took the valve back, returned below grade, and resumed shaping the cistern throat with a mason hammer, each strike placed where fracture met mortar line. On June 27th, Nettie Hale, 13 years old and all elbows from a season of thin meals, came alone with a slate under her arm and stood at the tunnel mouth until Clint climbed out for air. Her mother kept the schoolhouse stove. Her father drove freight when freight still moved. She did not laugh at the sight. She asked how deep, cool ground remained once topsoil turned to powder. Clint showed her the temperature difference with no speech, placing her left hand on sun-baked basalt and her right hand on stone from the tunnel face. She kept both palms there a long moment, then nodded once as if settling a sum. Before leaving, she copied 3 numbers from his tally board without asking: seep rise, draw interval, recharge, rest. She returned the next day with fresh chalk and copied them again. By the first week of July, daily highs crossed 104 degrees, and the town shifted from inconvenience to injury. Laundry dried stiff in less than an hour. Bread cracked at the crust before noon. 2 hired men at the South Pens quit after finding 3 calves dead beside an empty trough at daybreak, and the ranch owner paid wagon boys 15 cents each to haul creek mud in barrels, hoping stock would drink through sediment. At Silas Kincaid's store, the water price climbed from 5 cents to 12 cents per bucket on July 6th, then to 20 cents by July 11th, with credit extended first to households carrying old balances on his ledger. Those without account history paid cash or waited. Those with no cash waited longer. Clint did not speak publicly against him. He changed his own system instead. He finished the main cistern lining with a final lime wash, then cured it under damp canvas for 48 hours so the mortar would set without shrink cracks. He built a roofed access shed 12 feet by 14, with double-planked walls and a vented cap that let heat rise but kept direct sun off the draw shaft. He buried 2 cedar tanks, each holding roughly 180 gallons, on the east side of the shed where morning shade lasted longest, linking them by 2-inch pipe with gate valves cut from salvaged brass so flow could be isolated if one line fouled. He spread packed clay berms around the structure to direct rare storm runoff away from the tunnel mouth and reduce silt load at entry. Every addition cost him strength he could not spare. Every addition saved water he would soon need. On July 14th, he tested the pump assembly at full stroke for the first time. The leather seals caught on the second lift, then held, and clear water climbed the standpipe in a steady column before falling into the settling trough with a sound no one in Sage Hollow had heard in weeks. Not splash, but continuity. He timed output at 1 gallon every 42 seconds with moderate effort, slower than a town well in wet years, but far more dependable than surface draw now. He ran the handle for 15 minutes, shut down for 2 hours, then measured recovery. The fracture vein rose back as he had hoped. Not fast, not dramatic, but persistent. And persistence was the only currency Drought could not counterfeit. Word spread by evening. The first visitors came with curiosity, the second with pails hidden under wagon blankets, the third with hard expressions meant to preserve pride. Clint served none that night because the system had not yet been calibrated and haste would wreck it. He posted a board at the path fork in charcoal block letters, large enough for any reader at 10 paces. No draw until measurements complete. Return at sunrise June 16th. One man spat at the board. Another called him selfish. A woman whose husband owed Silas money touched the edge of the sign with 2 fingers and stood there without speaking, until dark drove her home. 3 days passed before the first formal line formed. It reached 12 households by dawn and 31 by mid-morning, each holding pails, crocks, and whiskey barrels scrubbed for reuse. Clint did not take payment at the pump. He took names, family counts, and container capacity in a ledger with ruled columns he had drawn himself. He issued rough-cut wood tokens, one per household for each draw interval, notched by day and hour. The strong stood in line beside the weak because the token, not the shoulder, governed access. Nettie Hale read names aloud for those who could not read their own. And by noon she was managing order better than half the town constables had managed anything that summer. Silas came at sunset in a clean vest gone damp at the collar and watched 2 full rounds without stepping into line. He counted tokens. He watched Clint reject a second draw request from a ranch foreman who offered 50 cents cash under the ledger table. He watched Clint fill a half bucket for an elderly widow before finishing a full allotment for a teamster built like an ox. Then he spoke loudly enough for all to hear. "You have made a spectacle from scarcity, Tucker. A line and a token do not make a reservoir. They make theater." Clint closed the ledger, set the pencil across its spine, and answered without raising his voice. "A theater closes when applause ends. This will run if rules hold. If rules fail, it dies. Choose which you prefer." Silas held his stare, then turned back toward town as if he had not been addressed. Yet 2 of his own clerks appeared in line before dawn the next day, carrying store barrels and wearing expressions that had no room left for laughter. By the 3rd week of July, Sage Hollow still called the place Tucker's Puddle in old habit. But fewer spoke the name with scorn, and more spoke it as one speaks a map when the road ahead has narrowed to a single pass. The narrowed road held through the next dawn, and at first light Clint was already at the valve trench, with a shovel cut down to fit his injured grip, deepening the east side line by 4 inches so the buried cedar tank sat below the day's heat, instead of merely beside it. He worked by sequence and chalk marks, not by urgency alone. Open tank 1 for morning draw, close at 1/3 remaining. Bleed sediment from the settling trough, then shift to tank 2 while the main cistern recovered in shade. Nettie Hale stood at the ledger board with a carpenter's square in one hand, keeping the token slots aligned by hour, and no one who stepped into line mistook her task for child's play. Each name entered, each bucket measured, each interval respected. A water system was not built once. It was built daily. By July 24th, he had added a second filter crib between the pump standpipe and distribution trough, a box 6 feet long, 3 feet deep, layered in descending grade. Fist stone, crushed limestone, river sand screened through wire, and charcoal granules burned and washed twice to clear ash. He tested turbidity in clear glass medicine bottles set against white lime wash, comparing morning draw to noon draw, and both to water from the failing public wells. He charged no fee for these demonstrations, but he insisted that each household head watch at least 1 full cycle before receiving an extra ration token for livestock. When the butcher from the South Road complained that observation wasted daylight, Clint handed him a bottle from the schoolhouse well, where suspended silt floated like smoke in weak tea, then a bottle from the gallery line, where the sediment settled to a thin coin at the bottom after 1 hour. The butcher took the lesson home without further argument. He expanded storage because pattern demanded it. On 26th of July, he purchased 2 used barrel hoops, 9 lengths of salvage plank, and 27 pounds of lime for $14.60, then framed a low earth-banked annex against the shed's north wall, 8 feet by 10, with a double roof of plank and packed clay to keep the interior near ground temperature. Inside, he set crock stands and 3 reserve vats lined with waxed cloth, each marked by a depth rod scored in 1/4-inch increments. At full mark, Those vats held another 124 gallons, not enough to save a careless town, but enough to absorb a day of panic. He recorded fill and draw at sunrise, noon, and sunset in a ruled book Nettie kept dry inside an oilskin satchel. When values dipped below projected recharge, he shortened draws by 5 minutes and increased rest intervals by 20. Households complained. The numbers held. Silas Kincaid watched all this from changing distances. On some evenings, he remained on his porch, hands folded over his vest, speaking to passers-by as if the line north of town were a temporary fever. On others, he rode out and dismounted among the waiting pails with an expression of practiced concern, asking whether Clint had a sanitary permit from the council, whether storage near basalt might leach bitter salts, whether tokens could be forged and sold by drifters. None of these questions was idle. Each was a seed planted where fear had loosened reason. By the last week of July, a notice appeared on the church door announcing a special town discussion on private control of common necessity, and everyone understood whom that phrase meant. The meeting filled the benches past sundown. The preacher spoke first about order, then about charity, then yielded to Councilman Briggs, who read a proposal drafted at Silas's table. Any water source serving more than 20 households would be subject to town levy, inspection fee, and allocation oversight through the mercantile office. The wording sounded orderly. Its effect would have placed every ration decision under the same credit ledger that already favored debtors and punished the poor. Men nodded who had never read a flowchart or touched a pump leather in their lives. A few women who had carried water 6 times that day did not nod at all. Clint stood when called and spoke in the plain cadence of a tradesman giving tolerance limits. If you add levy now, I lose lime and leather stock. If you route tokens through store credit, the weakest households draw last. If you force full opening each morning to satisfy appearances, recharge fails by August. The gallery will not answer to pride. It answers to rate and rest. He placed his ledger on the front pew and opened to the previous 10 days. Gallons drawn, gallons recovered, failures prevented by reduced noon access. Nettie, seated 2 benches back, read the columns aloud for those who could not follow figures by lamp glare. The proposal failed by 6 votes. Silas's mouth tightened, but he smiled as if the result had been expected. Defeat at the bench became cruelty on the street. 2 mornings later, someone had painted Tucker's Puddle above the shed door in tar, letters tall as a man's forearm. A string of boys repeated it when he passed with sand sacks, then fell quiet when Nettie looked up from the board and called each by name. At the store, clerks who once sold him fittings without comment now set his purchases aside until all others had been served, even when he carried cash exact to the cent. At the blacksmith, a ranch hand remarked that a half-crippled mechanic had mistaken a ditch for a destiny, and 3 men laughed because laughter still cost less than humility. Clint did not answer the taunts. He asked the blacksmith for 2 hinge pins and a grate bar, paid $1.15, and returned to work before the forge had dimmed. By July 31st, mockery found institutional shape again. The school board, under pressure from families tied to Silas's credit, forbade pupils from idle attendance at the spring house during lesson hours, naming Nettie directly in the margin note as a caution. Her mother received the notice folded in thirds with no signature. Nettie brought it to the sheet at noon, set it beside the ledger, and waited. Clint read it once, then built a compromise no board could easily refuse. Token accounting would move to dawn and dusk, outside school hours, and any pupil who helped with tally would receive arithmetic instruction tied to volume, ratio, and storage loss. He delivered that offer in writing to the board chair with 2 pages of sample problems. By Thursday, 6 pupils came before class to copy figures in careful columns. By Saturday, their sums were cleaner than many merchants' books. The weather gave no quarter while this struggle unfolded. On August 3rd, the noon reading reached 106 degrees in shade. On August 7th, it reached 108. By then, even the cottonwood at the creek bend had begun dropping leaves green at the stem, sacrificing limb to preserve trunk, and swallows that usually traced evening arcs above town had shifted to higher, thinner flight as insect bands collapsed near the dry ground. Jackrabbits moved before sunrise and vanished by 7. Ant lines thickened along cellar foundations, carrying pale eggs upward, not down, as if even the soil's hidden cool was retreating. Clint had seen those signs in Tennessee and again near Cannon City. When animals changed schedule, water tables were already in retreat. He tested the warning against stone and number rather than omen. At dusk on August 8th, he drove 2 iron rods into separate test holes near the old creek terrace, one at 3 feet, one at 6, and wrapped each in damp cloth strips weighed to quarter ounces. At dawn, he reweighed them on a small spring scale. Both had lost moisture faster than the previous week, and the deeper strip had fallen by nearly the same margin as the shallow one, meaning dryness was no longer merely surface heat. He posted a new rule board at the path fork. No livestock draw between 10 and 4. Household water first. Store in shade. Cover every vessel. The ranchers protested as one body. He offered them a workshop instead of an argument, showing how to scrape shallow seep pits in low north-facing swales, line them with brush and cloth, and let seep accumulation serve stock without touching the household reserve. Some accepted the lesson that day. Others called it theater and rode away. 3 days passed before the first of those same ranchers returned at dawn with blistered hands and a request for the lining method again, this time with no audience. Clint taught him without mention of prior scorn. He taught the second and the third in the same manner, marking pit diameter by boot length and telling them to shade with wagon canvas held 3 feet above ground for airflow. By August 12th, 5 ranch lots had functioning seep pits, each producing modestly, each reducing strain on the gallery by a few precious gallons. The town did not call these pits Clint's design in public, yet the method spread from fence to fence. Silas responded by tightening prices once more. Water from warehouse barrels rose to 30 cents a bucket, and preference went first to accounts carrying grain debt over $40. A widow turned away at noon, waited in the street until dusk, and then walked north with 2 cracked crocks and no words for anyone. Behind the store, 2 clerks rolled out a cask that smelled sour at the bung. Men who had defended Silas in July stared at that barrel and said nothing. By the 3rd week of August, the warning signs had become too numerous to deny, yet denial still found language. A banker from Granite Falls passing through claimed a wet September was guaranteed by mountain haze. A preacher from a neighboring circuit called hardship, a test that would end when faith was properly arranged. Teamsters pointed to distant thunderheads that built each afternoon and dissolved by nightfall, reading promise into every cloud that did not rain. Clint read the same sky and studied the wind under it, noting dry downdrafts and dust plumes that broke apart before touching ground. He shifted draw intervals again, reducing each household allotment by 1 quart per token, and adding priority marks beside the names of elders with fever and mothers nursing infants, entries Nettie copied from the schoolhouse welfare list. Complaints rose sharp for 2 days, then softened when recovery readings improved. On August 21st, with the shade thermometer at 109 degrees by 2 o'clock, he began a full 24-hour recharge test on the main gallery, sealing all outflow at sunset and posting guards chosen by rotation from 8 households, none paid, all recorded. Some called the closure proof the Puddle had failed. Others waited in silence because they understood that proof required measurement, not rumor. Through that long night, the shed stood dark except for one lantern at the ledger table, and the line at dawn formed before the first bell from town. Men and women counted steps from their doors to the path, as if counting could shorten distance. They were no longer measuring pride. They were measuring survival. When the first bell sounded from town, Clint unsealed the gallery outflow and lowered the depth rod into the main cistern, while Nettie held the lantern close enough to read the marks. The water had recovered to within 1 inch of full line after 24 hours of rest, a measured gain of 312 gallons when the 2 cedar tanks and reserve vats were counted together, and the number passed through the waiting line in a low murmur that carried equal parts relief and fear. Relief, because the source was real. Fear, because every soul in Sage Hollow now understood that the margin between order and panic could be calculated in hours. Clint wrote the figure at the top of the ledger page for August 22, 1887, drew a hard line beneath it, and began distribution at reduced interval, 1 token per household, no exceptions. By August 25th, the afternoon shade temperature behind the church reached 110 degrees, and wind from the south began arriving hot enough to curl the edges of prayer notices nailed to the chapel post. The town catchments beside Silas Kincaid's warehouse, already shallow and poorly sealed, shrank into cracked basins where clay pulled away from plank rims like old paint from dry boards. Boys sent to scrape the bottoms found only bitter residue and dead beetles. 2 ranch wells east of town failed within the same day, first giving cloudy draw, then nothing but wet rope. In the pens, cattle crowded troughs before dawn and stood with tongues out by noon. A mule team collapsed on Freight Street after hauling empty casks from the creek bend, and the driver cut the harness to save the animals, then sat in the road with the leather reins in his lap, as if he had forgotten what hands were for. Silas responded as he had always responded, by treating scarcity as a market rather than a warning. On August 26th, he raised warehouse water to 40 cents a bucket and directed his clerks to honor only accounts tied to grain debt above $20, believing loyalty could be purchased if panic was rationed through his counter. That policy held for less than 2 days. The barrels he had bought at premium from passing freighters had sat too long in direct heat. By the 3rd morning, bung staves swelled, iron hoops loosened, and a sour, algae-heavy odor drifted from the storage row. Women who had paid in cash for evening draw returned at dawn with pails clouded green and demanded replacement. Silas ordered the casks rolled into shade and covered with canvas, but the damage had moved through the lot faster than his clerks could recoup and reseal. The shelves of his store remained full of sugar, lamp oil, and coffee tins, yet the one good that mattered had turned against him. A week later, on September 1st, the disaster ceased to be a season and became an event with a date. The noon reading at the schoolhouse stood at 112 degrees in shade. A dry thunderhead built over the west ridge by mid-afternoon, threw lightning into open range without rain, and drove a hard gust front through Sage Hollow that ripped 2 roof sheets from the livery, collapsed 1 wall of the empty south catchment, and filled every open vessel with dust fine as flour. The wind was not relief. It was a furnace bellows. By evening, the path to Clint's spring house carried a line of 72 households, including families that had mocked the token board all July and now carried their best crockery wrapped in quilts so no drop would be lost on the walk home. Nettie added a second tally page because one would not hold the names. 3 days passed before the road teams sent east returned, and when they did return, they brought not water, but broken hardware. 2 wagons hauling empty casks had lost axles in rutted, heat-hardened roadbed near Granite Falls and turned back with split hubs and blistered horses. A 3rd team had reached a settlement 11 miles north only to find its own wells rationed under guard. Men who had left town confident came back speaking in short, practical phrases and drinking from canteens that clicked hollow when set down. Their report ended the last argument for outside rescue. Sage Hollow had one functioning system within 12 miles, and everyone knew where it stood. The first death came on September the 4th, in the blue hour before sunrise, when Martha Keene, seamstress for half the town and 52 years old that summer, left her porch with 2 empty pails balanced against her hips and attempted the walk north before line hours began. She had spent the night cutting cloth strips for evaporative wraps, and neighbors later said she had refused rest because 3 households were waiting on her mending. She reached the alley behind Tanner's stable, set 1 pail down, then sank to her knees and could not stand again. There was no spectacle around it, no shouted crowd, only 2 women running from opposite doors and a church bell rung once. Then again, as if repetition might alter fact, she died with 1 hand still around the pail handle, 3 doors from her own house. The pails were dry. Clint entered her name in the ledger margin that morning, not in the ration column, but in a separate list he had begun for losses, and he shifted the first draw 20 minutes earlier, so elderly households would not queue in rising heat. The line moved in silence. Even men who had once laughed at the painted tar letters on his shed spoke in nods and hand signals, conserving breath as if words themselves required moisture. The second death followed on September 6th along the dry trail to South Fork pasture. Eli Boone, ranch hand, 29 years old, had ridden out with 2 older boys at dawn to recover strayed stock and carried 1 canteen between the 3 of them because every vessel in town was being directed to household draw. By noon, the sun had turned the trail white and hard. Eli gave the canteen to the boys when one began stumbling near the basalt cut and told them to continue toward town while he brought the horse at slower pace. The boys reached the north pens and reported his position, and 2 men rode back with spare water. They found him seated against a fence post, hat in his lap, horse reins looped once around his wrist. He did not survive the return ride. At dusk, the boys stood beside the pen gate with their fathers, each holding the emptied canteen as if it had become a document. By the second week of September, the arithmetic of thirst had entered every room in Sage Hollow. Bread was mixed with measured spoonfuls and baked under cloth to trap steam. Wash water was saved for floors, then for dust suppression at door sills. Church services were shortened because crowded benches raised heat too quickly. The school closed after noon and reopened at dawn so children could carry household water while the day was still tolerable. The contrast between preparations was visible from any rise above town. Near the warehouse, split casks and cracked catchments under a haze of flies. On the north slope, shaded tanks, covered troughs, depth rods, and a line that moved by rule instead of force. Systems built for appearances had failed first. Systems built for recharge still held. Silas's authority thinned in equal measure. He had built it on credit, inventory, and the assumption that access flowed through his counter. Now mothers with clean ledgers stood in the same token line as laborers who owed him $60, and neither group waited for his permission. On the 8th of September, he attempted to reassert control by sending 2 paid men to the path fork with instructions to reserve first draw for warehouse account holders. The men lasted 1 hour. When the line tightened and word spread that the guards were turning away fever households, Nettie walked from the tally board to the fork and read aloud the priority list she had maintained since July. Elders, nursing mothers, the infirm, then all others by token hour. She did not shout. She read names. Clint arrived with the ledger, repeated the order once, and told the guards they were welcome to join the line as citizens or leave as employees. They left and returned at dusk, carrying their own pails. That same evening, with heat still radiating from the basalt after sunset, Silas Kincaid came to the shed without vest or hatband, his shirt dark at the collar, his posture altered by exhaustion rather than ceremony. Beside him stood his wife, Eliza, and his sister, Naomi, each carrying a covered crock. He did not step to the front. He waited until Clint finished a draw for the Ortiz household and looked up from the valve wheel. When Silas finally spoke, the words came stripped of porch confidence. "My barrels are sour. My road teams returned empty. I cannot keep water fit to drink through one full day. My family requires allotment, and so do the households on my books. Tell me what terms you set." The crux of the town's reckoning began there, not in church, but in dust and lamplight beside a hand pump. Clint did not answer quickly because haste had damaged too much already. He set the valve pin, wiped his hand on a rag, and spoke so the whole line could hear. There are no private terms. There are only survival rules. Your family draws by token and priority, as every family does. Your clerks will report at dawn to Hall Shaded Reserve to homebound elders. Your warehouse teams will stop chasing distant barrels and start digging seep pits where I mark them. If your account holders need water, they stand here under the same board as everyone else. Silas nodded once. No one in line moved. A line of temporal fact settled over the next 48 hours. By dawn on September 10th, 8 hauling crews had been formed, each with 2 mules, 1 driver, 1 ledger runner, and 1 vessel checker to inspect lids and cloth seals. Clint assigned routes by elevation so the longest climbs were served first in morning cool. Nettie managed the household board, adding red chalk marks for fever cases and striking names only after vessel lids were tied in place. Silas's clerks, who had once delayed Clint at the store counter, now carried sand sacks and beeswax rolls from shed to porch under his written order. No one called it charity. It was logistics under pressure. Help was sought from every quarter once pride collapsed. Ranchers came for pit placement maps. Church deacons came for instructions on converting the basement into a shaded holding room for reserve crocks. The blacksmith asked for exact dimensions to forge a second pump handle for night rotation. Even Councilman Briggs arrived with a notebook and requested a lesson in recharge timing, saying plainly that the town had governed by vote without understanding flow. Clint taught each one in sequence, using the same measurements he had used in June when they laughed at his stakes. He demonstrated seep pit diameter by boot length, cloth layering order, wax seal method, and draw rest ratios adjusted for temperature above 108 degrees. He required repetition, not applause. On September 12th, a third death was entered in the margin list. Samuel Ortiz, 8 months old, carried through the night with damp cloths and spooned water after his mother's milk failed in the heat. The household had stretched what they had with thinned goat milk and boiled draw while waiting on infant salts and condensed milk from the delayed freight run. Neither shipment arrived. He stopped breathing just before first bell in his mother's arms, while the dawn queue formed outside. At evening distribution, Clint reduced each household by 1 cup and redirected the saved volume to nursing mothers and fever cases, arguing that prevention and supply had become the same labor. No one objected. The drought had not broken. The town had not been spared sorrow. Yet by the middle of September, Sage Hollow was no longer a settlement waiting for rescue from elsewhere. It had become a community learning under hard instruction how to survive by rule, shared burden, and a spring gallery once mocked as a puddle. He turned that instruction into a routine before the sunset, sending each crew back out with chalked route boards, measured allotments, and strict return times, then opening the shed annex to hold those who could not endure another wait in open heat. The annex had been framed for crock storage, yet it became shelter as well. 40 degrees cooler than the street by late afternoon. with wet cloth hung across the vent slats and benches made from spare plank. Eliza Kincaid sat beside widows whose accounts had once been refused at her husband's counter, fanning them in silence while Nettie called token numbers and checked lids for wax seal and cloth tie. On September 13th, Clint added food to the water schedule because thirst no longer traveled alone. From his own stores, he brought dried beans, smoked rabbit, and 2 sacks of coarse cornmeal kept in tin-lined chests against damp. He did not have abundance, but he had reserve. And reserve shared early prevented hunger from turning lines into fights. The church basement, cooled with sanded floor and covered windows, became a kitchen at dawn and dusk, and Clint taught 3 volunteers how to boil with measured draw, then capture steam condensation under cloth tents and return it to the pot. Each cup mattered. Waste became a form of theft. The contrast between planning and pretense sharpened daily. Silas had spent more than $400 town on shallow catchments that cracked by August and private barrels that spoiled in heat. Clint had spent 168 of his own dollars, plus weeks of labor, on depth, shade, filtration, and ration math, and those choices still held under the fiercest readings. In public, there was less arguing now, because numbers had taken argument's place. A cistern depth rod did not flatter the wealthy. A recovery interval did not bow to status. 3 days later, a dust-caked courier from the council yard arrived with a timetable note from the freight captain and a shipment status report burned into the page by sun and delay. The update listed flour, salt blocks, and medical tinctures reaching the outskirts under escort, but no water barrels fit for immediate use. Several had split en route, and the rest carried stagnant residue after weeks of heat. Clint read the captain's apology as entered in the report, then directed the usable caskwood from the unload toward shade frames and seep pit covers, turning failed cargo into infrastructure by evening. Even disappointment could be worked if hands stayed steady. By the 18th of September, Sage Hollow had settled into a discipline that would have seemed harsh in spring and merciful now. First bell, fever and infant households. Second bell, elders and homebound deliveries. Mid-morning, general draw by token hour. Noon closure for recharge. Dusk draw for labor crews. Night rest, no exceptions. Nettie's ledger columns grew cleaner with each page, and she added a margin code for boil notices, contamination reports, and seep pit output on ranch lots. Knowledge spread outward from the north slope like irrigation from a narrow ditch, deliberate, measured, and life-giving. When the first storm clouds finally held together on September 28th, and rain struck the shed roof in hard, cold sheets, no one cheered at first. They listened. Rain after such heat could run off faster than it soaked, and a town taught by drought no longer trusted one generous hour. Clint set crews to channel diversion trenches away from the tunnel mouth, protected the filter crib from silt wash, and opened only designated capture points. By morning, the creek had a thread of moving water again, and by noon it carried enough flow to rinse mud from a boot heel. The emergency had bent. It had not vanished. Harvest came thin but real, and after the first cool week of October, the church called a gathering for accounting, burial remembrance, and new water law. Every bench filled. Families who had waited in token line now waited on words that were harder than waiting on draw. Martha Keene's sisters sat together near the front with her pails beside their feet. The Boone boys sat with hats in both hands. The Weaver family held one another in a row near the stove, where someone had placed a small white cloth and a single cedar sprig for Thomas. Councilman Briggs opened with figures: gallons drawn, gallons recovered, cases of fever reduced after boil rules, number of households served at peak line, cost of failed catchments, cost of repair under Clint's method. Then he stepped back and called for those who had spoken against the springhouse to speak plainly now. No one moved at first. The silence lasted long enough for floorboards to settle under shifting boots. Silas Kincaid stood. Prosperity had once fit him like tailored broadcloth. Now his coat hung looser, and his hands, though still well kept, bore fresh rope burn across the palms from hauling crews. He didn't look toward the back benches where his allies had sat all summer. He looked at Clint. "I named your work Tucker's Puddle on my porch, and in this town. And I did so to make careful labor look foolish while I sold confidence from a counter. I raised prices when fear rose. I tied water to debt. I told families that credit deserved life before need did. Then my own barrels soured, my teams failed, and my house stood in the same line as every other. Your rules kept my wife alive. Your ledger sent water to my sister when I could not secure one clean bucket in my own yard. I was wrong in method and wrong in spirit." He paused, swallowed, and continued, voice lower. "I ask no easy absolution. I place the warehouse account books under council review, and I surrender exclusive control of emergency stocks. If this town keeps me in trade, I trade under the water code set here, not under my old terms." After him came others, not with speeches polished for reputation, but with admissions cut to weight. The ranch foreman who had mocked juniper supports stood and quoted his own words about graves and pride, then admitted he had asked for seep pit lessons twice and had lived because he received them without rebuke. The blacksmith who had laughed at a half-closed hand held up the second pump handle he forged in September and said he had trusted arm strength over planning until planning proved stronger. The school board chair acknowledged the notice that tried to keep Nettie from the ledger, then tore the copy in front of the benches and proposed arithmetic lessons on storage and flow for every term henceforth. Nettie herself did not stand to accuse anyone. She walked to the front with the season's ledger, set it on the pulpit, and opened to the margin pages where losses had been entered in careful script. Martha Keene, Eli Boone, Thomas Weaver. She read each name once, then closed the book. Grief organized the room more effectively than any gavel. When Briggs asked Clint to answer, he rose slowly, one hand on the bench rail, and faced not only those who had mocked him, but those he had hauled beside at dawn. His voice carried as it always had, not loud, but exact. "I did not dig for revenge, and I did not keep records to purchase praise. My mother taught me in Tennessee that water punishes vanity first and ignorance second, and this season proved her right. You ask about forgiveness. I will say this clearly. Words alone dry fast. Changed practice endures. If you wish to honor the dead, do not honor me with compliments. Honor them by learning what almost killed us." He turned toward the side aisle where children stood with parents and nodded to Nettie. "Every household will learn 3 things before spring: storage that resists heat, drought timing that protects recharge, and shared ration rules that do not bend for wealth, anger, or influence. Those who already know will teach those who do not. We will keep one ledger, open to every eye. We will test wells on schedule, not in panic. We will maintain seep pits on every ranch lot and shade every vessel in July, whether rain seems likely or not." Then he looked back at Silas. "Your surrender of control is useful if it remains real in January, March, and next August. Keep it real. That will answer more than apology." No applause followed. The town stood instead, row by row, and signed the new code in the church register. 1 vote per household, 1 obligation per signature. Silas signed without title flourish. Eliza signed below him. Nettie signed with schoolhouse ink still staining 2 fingers. The Weaver family signed together, each hand touching the pen barrel in turn. By November, the first practical changes were visible from the road. Warehouse casks were moved under a ventilated shed with clay berm and shade cloth. Public wells received depth markers and cleaning intervals posted on nailed boards. The old catchments were excavated deeper, lined correctly and roofed, not left open to sun. At Clint's direction, teams cut additional gallery branches into cooler fracture lines and installed inspection ports every 12 feet so failures could be caught early. The town paid laborers by day for this work, and payment came from a shared levy approved in open meeting, not private account pressure. In the spring of 1888, when runoff came strong for 6 weeks, Sage Hollow did not spend that gift in celebration. It stored, sealed, and mapped. Children in the schoolyard learned to read cottonwood stress, ant migration, and morning stone temperature beside their letters and sums. By the second week of June, each household kept a shaded reserve crock with waxed cover and date mark. By late July, when heat rose again, lines at the spring house formed calmly because every soul understood interval and limit. Years moved. Dry years returned in 1890 and 1893, not as severe as the black season of 1887, yet stern enough to test memory. Memory held. The code held. Silas remained in trade, thinner in manner and never again tied emergency water to debt. When newcomers asked why warehouse barrels sat under layered roofs, and why school children could explain seep loss better than some drifters could explain cards, old residents answered with a phrase that had changed its meaning through labor. Build it like Tucker. By 1896, Sage Hollow counted 412 souls. The spring house on the north slope had grown into a modest community works yard with 3 trained keepers, rotating student clerks, and a public ledger hung in a glass front cabinet at church and copied monthly at the store. The painted tar insult had long been scrubbed away, but a board remained above the shed door with carved letters cut by the blacksmith and finished by Nettie, now a teacher. Water is a common duty. Clint still worked with the same injured hand, slower in winter, steady in summer, and when asked what had saved the town, he always answered in the plural: depth, shade, rules, sharing. He named Martha, Eli, and Thomas whenever the story was told, because instruction without remembrance could harden into pride again. The spring house still stands on that basalt rise north of Sage Hollow. In dry months, families still walk the path by token hour, though now they do so under cottonwoods planted after the drought as living shade for those yet to come. The ledger system remains public. The training remains compulsory. And in that town, where laughter once named wisdom a puddle, children learn before gossip that foresight is not fear, and generosity under pressure is the only form of victory worth keeping. That lesson was still being recited on a cold, bright morning in March of 1897, when Nettie Hale set a basin of dry sand on the front table of the Sage Hollow schoolroom and asked 12 children to place 1 covered jar and 1 open cup side by side beneath the stove heat. Clint stood at the back wall with his hat in both hands, his injured right fingers resting against the brim, while Silas Kincaid, now serving on the water committee by annual vote, copied the exercise into a new primer ledger ordered for spring term. By noon, the open cup had lost nearly 1/3 of its measure, and the covered jar had lost almost none. Nettie did not call this cleverness. She called it duty, proven by a scale. 3 days later, with wind running hard down the north draw, the town tested the emergency code as if drought had returned in full. Councilman Briggs rang first bell at 5 in the morning, and each household sent 1 representative to the spring house with marked vessels and waxed cloth, as required by ordinance. Clint opened valve 1, closed valve 2, and had the blacksmith read the depth rod aloud so every soul in line could hear the starting measure before any draw began. Eliza Kincaid supervised lid checks. The ranch foreman who once mocked Juniper supports inspected seep pit kits stacked under the annex roof, brush bundles, 2 cloth lengths per lot, and a chalk card with pit diameter and shading instructions. What had once depended on one man's memory now lived in shared procedure. On the 11th of April, the delayed freight system that had failed the town in 1887 finally received formal review at the church hall, where the captain's old report was read beside 3 later manifests, and the town voted to keep 6 months of reserve salts, flour, and medicinal tinctures under joint lock rather than merchant control. The lock itself had 2 keys, one held by the council clerk, one by the schoolhouse keeper, and no release without both signatures in the public book. Silas offered his warehouse annex as storage and paid for the interior lime wash himself, but the stock was counted by rotating teams, including widows and hired hands, so no credit ledger could ever again become a gate between need and survival. The memory of sour barrels remained stronger than any argument. By the second week of May, Clint asked the committee to walk the old catchments near the warehouse, not to shame the men who had built them in panic, but to document failure properly. Cracks still traced the clay lining, and one basin floor had settled 6 inches where compaction had been rushed. He measured each defect, then had the younger laborers compare those notes with the gallery works on the north slope. Shaded intake, packed berms, inspection ports every 12 feet, and filtration beds rebuilt on schedule. The contrast was plain in numbers. The failed basins had cost $402.70 before repair. The gallery and additions, including later branch work, had cost less cash than that and more labor, but the labor had stayed in town as skill. The reckoning that mattered most did not happen in one hall after that. It unfolded at porches, work tables, and fence gates where memory had room to speak without performance. A week after the inspection walk, the school board chair, Miriam Pike, came to the spring house at dusk and asked Nettie to bring the old notice that had once barred pupils from ledger duty. Nettie laid the folded paper on the bench between them. Miriam read the line naming Nettie as a caution, then signed beneath it in fresh ink, rescinded and entered into permanent record of error. May 18, 1897. She took no defense from custom, only responsibility. Nettie placed the corrected notice in the cabinet beside the ration books, so future boards would see both documents together. 2 evenings later, the woman who had touched Clint's first rule board in silence during July of 1887 came again with a covered crock and finally gave her name in full. Ada Lark, seam finisher and Martha Keene's cousin. She said she had recognized on that first night that the sign meant order rather than refusal. But she had lacked the standing to say so while men were jeering at the path fork. She asked whether her silence had cost time that could have helped Martha. Clint answered with the same restraint that had steadied the line years before. He said one voice rarely changes a town in a day, yet one voice repeated in season can change a town in a generation. And he asked her to teach vessel sealing at the next women's cooperative meeting. She accepted, and by harvest she had trained 31 households. In early June, Silas came alone after closing his store, carrying a wrapped parcel under one arm. He set it on the workbench and unrolled Clint's old silver watch, the same cracked enamel face sold for pipe and nails at the beginning of the drought. Silas had purchased it from the freighter who bought it years earlier and had kept it in his desk, uncertain whether returning it would be mercy or intrusion. He said he had delayed because he did not wish to perform remorse in public. Clint turned the watch over once, felt its stop weight, and asked what Silas intended to do when the next merchant arrived, offering quick profit on emergency goods. Silas answered without evasion. Fixed margins entered before crisis, council review on every emergency lot, no preferential sale by debt, and expulsion from committee if he violated the code. Clint nodded and told him to put those terms in writing before sundown. Silas did so, signed by witness, and posted the sheet at his own counter. On July 2nd, 1897, exactly 10 years and 1 month after the second well first dropped, Sage Hollow held a full-day water drill under summer heat that reached 101 degrees by afternoon. Children ran message cards from schoolhouse to spring yard. Ranch crews built and shaded test pits under timed instruction. The church basement kitchen boiled and condensed 2 kettles by protocol, then logged return volume to the ounce. At dusk, the committee opened the memorial ledger and read the 3 names most often spoken when complacency threatened: Martha Keene, Eli Boone, and Samuel Ortiz. The earlier confusion in one copied book had been corrected the previous winter after church and family records were compared line by line, and Nettie entered the corrected notation with both surnames indexed, so no child studying the archive would inherit error as fact. When asked to speak that evening, Clint stood by the pump handle rather than the pulpit. His speech was not ornamental, but it carried the gravity of a man who had paid for every sentence with labor. He said the town had mistaken visibility for security in 1887, trusting creek surface, shallow basins, and store inventory, while ignoring recharge, shade, and equitable rules. He said that mistake had killed named neighbors, and memory without structural change was only another vanity. He did not offer absolution as a transaction. He offered continuity as obligation. Keep measurements public. Keep training compulsory. Keep reserves distributed. Teach children to read land before rumor. If those practices held, then apology had meaning. If they failed, apology was dust. The crowd did not cheer. They moved instead toward stations already laid out for work: lid sealing, valve grease, depth rod calibration, and ledger copying. Silas took the late shift at contamination inspection with the same care once reserved for counting cash receipts. Eliza supervised the infant priority board and corrected 2 entries herself when family counts changed. Nettie locked the day log in the glass cabinet, then left the key with the night clerk and walked the path home under cottonwoods planted by schoolchildren whose fathers had once laughed at the words, "Tucker's Puddle." The spring house still stands on the basalt rise north of Sage Hollow, and the carved board above its door still reads, "Water is a common duty." The cedar tanks from Clint's first expansion were retired in 1903. Staves split and repurposed into tool racks, now hanging inside the works shed, while the original pump cylinder, leather seal pattern, and first depth rod remain on a dedicated wall for instruction. The old tar insult was never repainted. In its place hangs a smaller plaque cut by the same blacksmith hand that once mocked and later learned, "Build it like Tucker." In summer, the line forms by token hour under shade trees grown tall enough to cover the waiting bench. In winter, schoolchildren still run evaporation tests beside the stove and copy recharge ratios in steady columns. The reserve hall keeps 6 months of essentials under dual lock, counted in public each quarter. Merchants trade, councils change, and seasons turn stern or generous by their own law. Yet the town no longer confuses optimism with preparation. The knowledge passed from Ruth Tucker in Tennessee Hill Country through a son with a damaged hand on a basalt lot outside town now passes through many hands by design. That is how Sage Hollow keeps water. That is how it keeps faith with its dead.